Good morning, everyone. My name is Kevin Legore. I'm the product specialist for Skywatcher here in North America, and welcome to the What's Up Webcast. We do this every Friday, 10 a.m. Pacific, right here at the Skywatcher USA YouTube channel. The What's Up Webcast is just a big educational collection of stuff. We check out everything that's up in the nighttime sky, from what's ups for viewing to helpful tips and tricks about equipment, and pretty much anything we feel like doing. And then, of course, the last Friday of every month, we have a special guest on to talk about all kinds of cool stuff. And so that's what we do here. If you like what you see here, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. It does help us out. And of course, if you're new here, welcome. Happy Friday. And then, of course, everyone who has joined us for previous episodes, welcome back once again. So today we have a really good friend of ours here. We've known him for a long time. His name is Bryan Cogdell. He's worked in the industry for over 20 years at this point, so he's very experienced with telescope equipment. He's a fantastic imager, and he has opened up his own telescope hosting site, and that's what we're going to be talking to him about today, about remote imaging. Things to consider if you're gonna think about having a remote setup, and kind of just go from there. So I'm gonna bring Bryan in. Bryan's in California, so let me pop this up. Hey Bryan, how you doing this morning?
Hi, morning. Doing well. Happy Friday.
Yes. So thanks for spending the morning with us. I know we're all busy doing stuff, and I know you've been busy, clearly, from what you're sitting in at the moment. Um, so I ask everybody pretty much the same question of how did you get started in astronomy, and to where it made you want to have a remote site like you've got now.
Yeah, it's literally been a lifelong pursuit. The interest in astronomy, it's one of those things where it started around like kindergarten, and just had a innate fascination with the stars. And so, as a kid, pouring through books and getting more fascinated by it, and then being growing up in the Bay Area in San Jose, it seems to me like it was very astronomy friendly. Astro clubs were accessible. I could drive somewhere later as I got older and easily get access to any kind of telescope, and meet with the Astro Club. So that was good. And then at some point, I decided, oh, I should put a camera on the telescope, and that was the beginning and the end. And a lot of hobbyists know that's when you're not coming back, when you start to get into astro imaging. You're like, oh, this is fun. I think I'll take some pictures through the telescope. And it's funny, the very first image that I took with film through like a 10-inch Schmidt cast that wasn't even really like aligned, this blurry little smudge of N42, but I saw the red on the film and I was like, oh my God. And so that was it. I was at that point, I was like pursuing it more and more, and getting more into astro imaging, and transitioning into the CCD and digital era and doing all that. So it's been a lifelong pursuit. And then the idea of wanting to be in a dark sky permanently, that also started some time ago, and it was kind of a very long pursuit to kind of find what I was looking for and end up where I am now. So it's been, yeah, you could count years, but it's easier to say lifelong.
Awesome. Um, so for those watching, I'm aware of what Skies Away is, but a lot of people probably don't know what Skies Away is. So can you kind of explain to people what is Skies Away? I know it's kind of a pretty broad thing, but it's now evolved into even more, obviously, from the observatory you're sitting in to a much bigger thing.
Yeah, yeah. So Skies Away as a whole, it's an astronomy services company. We have a few people in our network and we do a number of things. What we've been focusing on more recently, especially with the advent of COVID, we had in the past been doing some events in the greater Los Angeles area, but primarily we've been focusing more on the consulting side of things. We've actually helped a number of people remotely with astro imaging, and then also in person for those having needing some assistance in setting up their telescope, and more recently into doing full observatory installations for some clients. So we've now reached the point where we actually are providing observatory install services from start to finish, which includes consulting and working out what the needs are for your particular setup, for your location. And now, as you can see behind me, this is the one that I've been working on for some time. So this is now, Skies Away, now we have our first Skies Away remote observatory. So this is a full-time commercial build roll-off observatory where we can host telescopes here. And many of us are familiar with a number of different solutions that exist around the world with this type of setup. And I'm just really excited that we're now able to partake in that. A great thing about that, so like I say, telescope hosting from our dark sky site, it's in such a way that we're just able to make our nice dark sky, it's a Bortle 2 sky here, we're able to make that accessible to the world, being connected and allowing anyone who wants to have their setup here full-time, 24/7 astro imaging, collecting data becomes easy. You do it in your sleep. And I know a lot of us, that's kind of like the ultimate goal, is like, as far as astro imaging goes, it's to be able to just do that, wake up and have a beautiful set of data and take a lot of that work out of it. So yeah, so wrapping that up, it's astronomy services, and now our big debut is this commercial roll-off for dark sky telescope hosting.
And so I know there's people are probably familiar with roll-off roofs and domes and stuff like that. Normally they're just something you have in your backyard, but a hosting observatory like you've got is actually a rather large facility. What size is the roll-off that you're in now?
Yeah, this one it's just about 500 square feet. And because I'm kind of flying solo as far as the operation goes. So at first I'm like, oh, I'm gonna get a roll off and put 20 piers in there. And I thought about that. I'm like, I want something that's manageable for myself. So this is about 500 square feet, and it hosts 6 piers, very comfortably. It's like over a 7.5 foot footprint for each pier. And depending on what might be installed, there's a couple of piers that are actually allow even more space and more overhead clearance, so that you can put a pretty large instrument in here. And so yeah, and you make a good point. Yeah, there's a lot of backyard type of observatories, and I've done that too. I've built a nice little roll off. Enjoy that, and there was a lot of learnings in that too, which definitely helped lead me to this building, which addresses a lot of the issues that I think many of us face, especially with the roll-off style of observatory building. Everything's a compromise. Domes are great, roll-offs are great, and they all have their pros and cons. But I've tried to address many of the issues that you would actually encounter. One that you might see, just even looking behind me, big overhead clearance on purpose, so there's no need to park the telescope. That was a huge, for me, absolute set requirement. I don't even forget about diodes and limit sensors and warnings. I don't want to have to park the telescope, no matter where the telescope's pointed. And if something occurs and I need to close the roof right now, I just close the roof and don't even sweat about it. So that's one of the big ones that we addressed. And then the other thing is, a lot of times an observatory will have a roll-off, especially, will have a lot of obstruction. I tried to minimize that as best as possible, especially for the nature of a roll-off. We don't get a lot of wind here, so why don't we just kind of make the telescope and pier height pretty proportional to the end walls? So there's a lot of little considerations like that were built into this particular observatory.
I know what's interesting about this observatory. I've got some friends who have some roll-offs as well, and typically it kind of looks like a little shed or a little house with the A-frame roof, and that something like that. I know even the little one that you have on site for your own use is that design. You have to kind of be aware of clearance when the telescopes are parked, or even how tall the pier is, or how big the telescope and clearance is for all of that. But what's unique about this big one, um, and is the roof here isn't your typical A-frame. It's actually, arced, so it gives you kind of a clearance at that point for instruments.
Yep, very good point. Yeah, and it's pretty remarkable too. This type of corrugated steel roof is pretty self-reinforcing and like self-rigid. So ordinarily, you mentioned like with the A-frame, it's normal to have like cross members to kind of support that. And then so you have basically, even with the A-frame, you often still have the lower cross member kind of sweeping across. So you're not necessarily utilizing the space within that A-frame. So this is all usable space, and it's funny because the steel, it's lighter. It's lighter than stick construction, because by the time, if you're using all these 2x4s, and then you have this big you have like some plywood and on all that roofing material, it ends up being a much heavier structure. The other nice thing about metal, of course, as many of us who have dealt with, and I'm doing that currently with the smaller one, when you have stick construction, inevitably you're dealing with wood that moves and flexes and warps, and you have these two tracks that should be parallel, and there isn't a single roll-off owner that I know of who hasn't at least mentioned some form or another have faced various challenges with just having to keep those rails true and parallel, at least enough to where the roof can easily roll, not get stuck and those kinds of things. So what's nice about the steel is it's self-reinforcing. Like I mentioned, you don't need the cross members. It's lighter. And with this actually being a steel frame, and on a grade beam, they're going to stay parallel. The sunlight isn't going to, warp or expand anything. So it'll stay true like that. So I can rely on repeatable operation for this building.
That's awesome. And I know one other thing, I've seen other observatories do this, but one thing you've incorporated is, because you are in Central California. I think you're at about a 34, 35 degree latitude at that location. So you're still low enough, um, or south enough to where some of those really unique low southern targets become feasible. But for this particular observatory, I think what cool thing you've incorporated that I've seen from the building um, is the fact that you've actually allowed the south wall to drop, so you can actually get the clearance to get down into the south further.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a good point. So you can see this arch overhead clearance, and there's the south wall over there. That drops because if you didn't have it drop, you would have this big arch to the south, which is the sweet spot. That's the sky everyone wants, right? And it's also the sky that you can't get back if you miss some portion of the southern sky, you miss it. Whereas in the north, if you have some form of obstruction, you might be able to get it, if not later that night, at some point and during the year. So yeah, that wall drops. So our southern horizon is just as low as my natural topography will go. I think you can get down. I mean, you're within 10 degrees for basically all sides, but the south is like straight down to the horizon. Well, actually, now that we got a fully operational setup up here, I'm going to see we're approaching. We're approaching Omega Centauri season, and in like a month or so, see, I don't see why I wouldn't be able to pick that up from here with that drop southern roof. And then we also, speaking of obstruction, so as you mentioned, and the south roof folds down, the end wall folds down. The roll-off rolls to the north, which is a deliberate choice. And we have it rolling a good 6-7 feet. I can go up to like more than 8-foot pass because I keep the track longer, but we have a chain drive right now, and it goes to about 6.5 feet past the front end wall to minimize the northern obstruction. And even the northernmost pier, which is actually the one behind me right now, I'm still only getting about a 20-degree obstruction to the north, which is incredible for considering the entire roof is to the north. And it's, like I say, it's rolling more than 6 foot past, so it's minimizing that obstruction. Um, I could actually minimize that further by rolling it another foot or two. And then if you've got one of the central piers, the northern obstruction is essentially a non-issue. So I think for a roll-off, it's pretty exceptional in its ability to minimize that obstruction. East and west walls you're within 10 degrees. Actually kind of up to you. If you have an instrument that you want to go with a higher or taller pier, we can go above the end wall, and you've got plenty of overhead clearance depending on the telescope and what the needs are. You can have as best of a ideal horizon as reasonably possible for a group roll-off observatory.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's really gives you complete access to the sky. And I know out there your location's really awesome. Like you said, it's a Bortle 2 sky. So if you could imagine having your setup out there under Bortle 2, there's not much you can't hit in that dark of a sky. I mean, that's even levels of research grade. And I know I've been able to get on some of the systems that are out there, like you're one of the systems that are out there just to play with for a little bit. And I know some of the data that we've got out there, we're looking at 1.4 arc seconds per pixel for average seeing, it seems like. So the seeing out there is actually pretty good as well.
Yeah, that was a big one to factor in, because I know, especially when you get into the larger aperture instruments, the long focal length, and some of when you get to kind of research grade, seeing becomes like the number one enemy. It's almost as bad, if not in some cases worse, than light pollution. You absolutely need to have steady seeing. So we're in the foothills of the Santa Lucias. So that's the mountain range that will actually, if you follow it up, it'll take you to the Monterey Institute for Research Astronomy, MIRA, Choose Ridge, which a lot of folks from the Bay Area like to travel to for. It's along the Pacific coast range, right? So you get that laminar Pacific flow. So we're not a mile high in elevation, but we are in that foothill range. We get this very nice temperate Pacific onshore that keeps our seeing steady, and the actual local seeing conditions here are pretty good too. So we're in a gentle topography of rolling. Basically, it's like rolling pasture and oak woodland and oak savanna that surrounds us, and we're on an elevated parcel. So you get a gentle upward sloping rise to where this observatory is. And I've been measuring the seeing periodically. We're mostly always between 1 and 2 seconds, 1 and 2 arc seconds. And you get those still nights with a little bit of humidity. You go sub arc second. That's when it gets really exciting. But yeah, seeing's a big one. And you mentioned too, the Bortle 2 dark skies. So if you're looking at the light pollution map, we're just inside the gray. We're between the closest city here would be Paso Robles, about a 45-minute drive out. And we're basically right smack in the middle, halfway point between Los Angeles and San Francisco. So you obviously have those two massive light domes. Then you get to the central coast of California, and those light domes taper off. And there are some cities, trying to encroach with their light domes, but we're about as far off as we can reasonably be, and still actually live here and have, obviously broadband internet and UPS and, Amazon Prime. And it's kind of the best of both worlds. That's an important thing too, actually, the accessibility. You might want to ask me before I keep going on, but the accessibility was a big one, because we've been chasing down dark skies for years, and my wife and I were all corners of California before landing here. We were, far northeastern corner of the state, like Modoc and Shasta, terrific dark skies, and you have winters there, and then you have the Eastern Sierras, also terrific dark skies. Everything had a trade-off, and this was actually a really nice combination and a place that we can call home. So we're very happy to have that come true.
That's awesome. I'm trying to find a picture here real quick. Friends on Facebook. I think this is from the front yard. Let me just pop this up in front of Bryan here real quick. But correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is the summer Milky Way core from basically your front yard.
Yeah.
So that doesn't suck. So
that was just like casually like me grabbing a camera and like, hey, I wanted to silhouette that agave right there. So it was, yeah, yep. And there's that's the Milky Way. That was what I take that in June a couple of years ago. And we have so that's, you're looking there at southwestern sky. You're actually looking at the only real light dome that we have, which is kind of Paso Robles. It's a low light dome. I don't know how many degrees that is. Then you look, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, we're looking southeast, not southwest. When you look southwest, you're looking towards the very bottom fringes of like Big Sur and the Ventana Wilderness. And that side is Bortle 1. So we're like inside of that. You face the Pacific Ocean on that side. And on that side, I'm getting, glared out by zodiacal light. And when I first moved here, I'm like, oh my God, I see zodiacal light. This is awesome. I used to have to go to like a remote star party to pick that up, and now I got it from home. So I was really pleased to see that. So yeah, it's great. And I've been playing around with the SQM and getting these fantastic numbers, and I've learned to kind of like, okay, take a lot of those with a grain of salt. But we're getting some awesome SQMs that are aligned with our Bortle 2 class, dark sky that we've got here. So
there's some questions in the feed about the observatory, and since we're talking about that real quick, because I do want to get on to other stuff in here. But so for those who are watching and you have questions, it is a roll-off roof, so the whole metal roof above Bryan there does roll off completely, obviously exposing all the telescopes to the sky. The south wall is the only wall that drops. All the other walls maintain. They have to hold the roof. And then the roof rolls off onto a structure, but it rolls, actually, what's interesting about yours, as you said earlier, it rolls far enough back to where north isn't really obstructed that much either. And then all that is linked to, very similar, I guess, to like a garage door opener, but with a chain drive that just kind of pulls the whole roof back, kind of. So that's how that whole assembly actually works. But this observatory, someone was asking, this holds 6 piers at the moment, correct?
Right. That's right.
And that's 6 piers with, what's the footprint, the real estate footprint for each pier?
You got a 7.5 foot footprint for each pier, and the 2 center piers, the one behind me, and there's one more central pier. There's actually some photos online. You can kind of get an idea of the floor plan for the piers. So they have a 7.5 foot diameter, which is actually pretty generous even for a group roll up. It doesn't sound like a lot as a number, and then you actually go and space them out and put scopes next to each other, and you find that it's actually I wanted it to be relaxed enough to where I'm not stressing about not obstruction, but like stuff like, cables or if you've got a 24-inch plane wave CDK and you've got like a long, like an Esprit 150 next to it, you've got these 2 long, large scope and a long scope. I wanted that to not be an issue, obviously. So we took that into account. So yeah, if there's the northernmost pier and you can see 2 slots over, there's that central pier. You could put it, especially if you were to put like a large L mount on that, you can fit a large telescope there, and we control the pier height and not really be limited by aperture. Yeah, you could see up the fold down south wall there on that one photo, and then you see the whole thing open on the right of the screen. That's with the roof obviously off or rolled off and the south wall down. And yeah, so there's some cool tidbits on the website that kind of describe some of the considerations that were put into the building. And actually, now that you are showing the website, the nice thing, this was something I also kind of took the initiative on doing. Life would have been a lot easier if I just poured a nice big concrete slab. It really would have, but concrete, it holds it's a lot of thermal mass in concrete, and we have 100-degree days in the summer, and it can cool off at night, and you get a lot of heat convection, like coming off of tarmac or something. So we're in a nice grassy field. It's like it's a pasture, and you're being surrounded by like low-lying vegetation and moisture. That really helps the local seeing conditions. And so instead of pouring a big concrete slab, We're on a raised subfloor. The only concrete that we're using is for the piers themselves, big, deep piers with rebar and everything. And then there's a grade beam to support the, the structural members of the observatory. And then everything in between is just earth. And, we've got, grass, and there's some poppies and stuff growing around. And that vegetation not only kind of keeps down the dust, but it really helps with the thermal stuff. So we're not just radiating a bunch of heat at night, especially in the summer when you have those hot days. You tend to get, and those of us who have set up their telescope in a nice grassy field, or we go to a star party, one that comes to mind, like the Golden State Star Party up in Aden, California, you're on this big, same idea. You're on a big pasture. You're surrounded by all this grassy field and flat topography. You end up with really nice local seeing conditions. So the local seeing conditions being, what is your actual observing location responsible for when it comes to getting thermals and currents and that kind of thing. You can have good seeing, but you might have something like heat convecting off of something. So I tried to minimize that, and we also have good ventilation with the subfloor. So I say all that because, wow, I probably could have built this a lot faster if I just got just poured 30 yards of concrete and just made it happen. But this was a very good thing, I think, to take into consideration.
Yeah, that's when you're thinking stuff that big and telescopes that location supports. Every little bit matters out there. There was one customer. I'm sorry. One person in the chat. They were asking because we were talking about local seeing and stuff. But how many clear nights a year do you get roughly at that site?
We're at over 300 clear nights a year, which is insane. We actually have had some as far as astronomy goes, we've had terrific Februaries. As far as the drought goes, we've had some of the worst Februaries that I think have been recorded. So we actually had 2 years in a row with no rain in February, but good for the astronomers. But so a combined 300 plus nights, clear nights a year. Now, some are absolute perfect photometric nights, and some are partially, if you have some fog and in the early morning, or you have some high cirrus clouds, if you have a partial, like a spectroscopic night. So combined, it's over 300 nights a year. I'm collecting data as to how many of the nights are photometric, absolutely perfect with absolutely no cloud cover or moisture, and how many of those nights are spectroscopic. You mentioned that, yes, we're around 35 degrees north, 35.8 degrees north. We're below a lot of the rain that comes along the Pacific, like the jet stream. On average, we're getting like 15 to 20 inches of rain per year, usually between December and February. And I think the national average is like 37, 38 inches a year. It's California. It's dry. We're like in a dry, kind of an arid Mediterranean climate. So very, very temperate weather, and no snow, not at this elevation, and no, like we don't get dust storms or these crazy high wind during the day, or especially at night, unless we get a rainstorm or something like that. So very, very temperate climate, which was another thing too. So yeah, over 300 nights a year, you just pick a night and it's going to be clear. And I know, Kevin, because you've been logging in what should have been our wet season. We're getting all this data in January and February, and it's dry and everything. So
I think between
good for the astronomers, even if we're hurting for rain.
I know in the smaller observatory that's been kind of the prototype of this, there are 2 systems in there at the moment that it's been kind of just like a prototype test thing that you've been working with, and from the times that I've been able to do it, and some other friends of ours have done, I think in the first month we had almost 300 gigs of raw data between 2 telescopes. Of course, those are using really high resolution 61 megapixel cameras, but telescopes were running multiple weeks in a row, night after night after night, with multiple people testing it. But yeah, it's more of so clear nights are abundant. What's not abundant is the amount of memory needed to store the data that's accumulated from a lot of that. So
it's interesting. This summer is going to be interesting because this is supposed to be of course, winter, you get the nice long nights, but what's going to happen? We're just going to get so much data. And the same is true now with the advent of these high resolution CMOS cameras that are quickly becoming the norm. We're going to start to see that the data storage is going to become more and more significant. And another learning I know is that we're capturing data faster than we're able to really do anything with. I'm still sitting on a lot of raw data that I haven't processed, and because it was easy to capture, now I got to go through and actually process them. So I think that's going to continue to happen, where you just sit on mounds of imaging data that you're going to have to wait for some cloudy time or rainy time or some downtime to actually go through and process some of that.
Yeah.
So it's going to be interesting to see how it picks up this summer.
So one thing I wanted to get into, I appreciate everything we've talked about, but I've helping you test some of this stuff over the last couple months, just preparing for your big one here. If someone wants to set up a remote telescope, I think a lot of people think, okay, I just send you my stuff, hooray, telescope's on. But the telescope is actually the easy part of the entire process. And there's a lot of things that have to, especially safety precautions that have to be put in place for when you're running telescopes automated. So if there's someone who's watching who's like, hey, I'm really interested in talking to you about setting up something, what are some of the things that you would tell someone who's not really aware of how remote needs to work at this point? Because it is a very different experience than I put it in my backyard and put some software and hit go. You have to be very trusting of that system, that it's not going to tear cables out, or if there's a lightning storm, it doesn't explode, or stuff like that. So what someone who's considering maybe doing remote, regardless of where at this point, but what would you bring up to them?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and the term remote has become kind of a very broad, kind of ambiguous thing. And there's even a joke with some of the guys that I set up with at the LAAS site down above Fraser Park. Remote is it's kind of like, for some people, remote means I'm coming to the site every other night to fix it up, or sort out the cable management, or figure out why something has crashed. So the mindset to have is, you have to, especially during the setup, you have to imagine yourself not being there. And it sounds very easy to think, oh yeah, well, duh, it's remote. Well, think about it more and more, and you're like, yeah, something very casual, like I just need to power cycle something, or I just need to reset or unplug the USB. Suddenly, these little mundane things, if you're not physically there, you realize, oh, that's hard. And so a lot of things to address that. You absolutely need to have remote power switch for whatever device you're running. You need to be able to pretend that you're there power cycling it. But since you can't do that, you need to have the equipment necessary to power cycle. The same goes for unplugging your USB, at least virtually unplugging your USB. You can do that in various ways, but you need to actually cut the USB and then plug it back in. As you know, as everyone who images knows, there's no such thing as a system that doesn't need something that needs to be restarted. And just picture yourself remote. Oh, shoot, my camera's not responding. No big deal. I'll just pull the cable. Oh, wait, no, I can't do that. So that's a big part of it. And then you touched on safety. That's a big one too. You're not there and a lot of things are happening, and there's maybe there's a static surge or some grounding issue. And I have, and Kevin knows, we've come through some hard lessons about even when you have clean power that has good earth ground, you can have equipment that doesn't so much want to ground so well, and you can have grounding issues. So anyone who's setting up, there's some gear that I would highly recommend that normally you wouldn't be on your radar. Things like not just surge protectors, but like USB isolators and Ethernet isolators, and just grounding it like having a local ground, like at the building. Absolutely. I mean, I don't care if you have, if your grid power, if your PG&E meter or whatever, if you've got a copper rod, a couple hundred feet away. It's got to be at the building, absolute ground. I mean, that's a big one. So a lot of those things to consider, and cable management has to be clean. I find that sometimes easier said than done. Cable management, you can spend more time on that than setting up the telescope. So you bring that good point. The telescope's like the easy part. Sure, I'll set it up, polar align it. We'll get a T point. We'll have this thing pointing to within an arc minute or better of pointing accuracy, and tracking will be next to perfect. And that's great. That's all fine and good. Then you have all this auxiliary stuff around it and all the cables and power management and things. And so the term remote, if you really want it to be remote, you just have to imagine yourself not being there, which I know is simple, but you have to just go through all through those motions of, okay, I need this, I need that. And so there are some, like if I had someone moving in here, there are some like basic requirements, and I have some of that infrastructure in place already, like remote power switches and Ethernet isolators and stuff, but depending on the setup. And there's more than one way to do it. That's the other problem too. If you ask 10 people, well, how do you control your telescope remotely? I was like, well, maybe I use the Pegasus Astro power, like the power accessory, and an Intel NUC. Or maybe I'm using the Eagle, which actually behind me, I'm using the Eagle because I like it's all contained. Maybe I'm using a Raspberry Pi, or maybe I'm using a Fusion box, a software BISC Fusion box. There's so many ways to do it. There isn't a single right way to do it. And I think some of those options can be a little bit overwhelming. Like, well, what's the best route? The best route will depend on your particular setup and your particular needs. I happen to really like the more contained the box is, the better for cable management. But like I say, there's more than one way to do it.
I know. So someone was asking if this is Skywatcher's remote site. We do have a test set up in the prototype observatory just to kind of help Bryan knock out some of the bugs. That was like a temporary thing. But I don't know. Can I tell the story of what happened with that and what we?
Yeah, I mean, it's all part of the learning, and it's definitely was.
So we sent a setup out there just to shake some things out. That's now occupied by a separate system. But we wanted to do it because we wanted to kind of see where things would go with something like this. And that's where you learn a lot of things. And one thing that's come up before, and we've heard it before, is ground loops, where the electricity just whips back around through everything. And like Bryan said, you can ground everything the best you can. But until everything is isolated completely, it's not really a problem. And that's actually a really rare issue in the field. I know you've been imaging for years, and so have I, and it's never really been a problem where you get like a ground loop or something. We had a ground loop just randomly occur on the test setup, which fried the Paramount MX motor board, fried the 16803 control board, and welded the power cable onto the motor focuser housing. So, and it's not like it's anybody's fault or anything was done wrong. It's just, it happens when you have electronics. So that's one of the reasons. All of that's fixed, by the way. But that's one of the things that Bryan was talking about isolating every single thing after learning about that. So the telescope behind him and everything else that goes in there is isolated. But that's something you have to consider when doing remote. I know there's some questions here. We're probably going to jump into a Q&A sooner than late now, actually, would probably be a good. But Bryan, someone was asking what kind of gear do you need to make remote work? And I know one thing I'd like to mention is if you are going to do a remote telescope setup, you probably really want to have a mount that has like homing sensors, so it always knows where to default back to. You don't have to, but it really would be more ideal. But maybe you could elaborate on let's see, this question's kind of wrapped up in it, is does Bryan publish any recommended equipment list or options and equipment not recommended on his site? So being said, what are some of the stuff that you would recommend for a remote system, ideally?
Yeah, and starting from the ground up, the one thing you mentioned was a big one. So the mount should really have a way to home itself, so an absolute home position. If all else fails, the mount reinitializes itself to the home position. And when you think about that, no matter how perfectly, let's say you're using a German equatorial mount and you have it beautifully polar aligned, so you know that it's going to track well, but you still have the computer alignment, like the go-to alignment. And if you're an advanced user, you're probably plate solving. So it takes a picture of the sky, it plate solves the star pattern, it knows exactly where it's pointing. That's great. If something were to occur, a power failure, or if the mount reset at the wrong time, or if something, let's say the clutch or something, and the mount's not pointing where it thinks it should, suddenly you have a problem because you might be so far off, or you might be pointing at the ground. You can't just plate solve and restore. You absolutely have to have a mount that will home itself. And so there are a number of mounts that do that now, but that does rule out a lot of mounts. It's essentially a requirement because without that, inevitably it's going to require physically realigning the mount or just setting it back to its home position. Now, in my case, I'm here, I'm on site. If there are issues like that, of course I can address them personally. But if you're doing a remote setup, you've got to have that. So I'm really fond of the software BISC mounts. And I know a lot of the astrophysics mounts now have that. I have an older AP900 GTO without the home switches or anything, but the new mounts either have a home switch or they even have absolute encoders where no matter where the mount is pointed, it has a permanent account of where the mount is pointed. And you're seeing more of that now. So the absolute encoders, or the on-axis encoders on mounts will do that. The Paramount Mighty behind me has the home switch. The limit switch is pretty important too. Most mounts that have a home switch will have a limit switch. So it's not just going to keep slewing, nor could it keep slewing because it has internal cabling. But before it actually reaches the mechanical hard stop, it's going to have a limit switch. So if you've instructed it to track past meridian and it just keeps going, it will eventually stop no matter what because it's got a limit switch. This is the big one. So that's the core of your whole setup, is a good, reliable mount that can home itself. That's like, that just makes, not only does it make life easier, you just find it starts to mesh, your whole setup just starts to come together when you have this good, reliable mount. Then you have to have a way of, so instead of traditionally you'd have a laptop and you're just a bunch of USB cables to the telescope. It's kind of like that, but instead of a laptop, you want to have something more contained. And this has also been a very rapid progressing trend. There's the Eagle. The Eagle is a perfect example of that. It's a Windows 10 PC, but it's more than the sum of its parts. So it's like, well, it's just a PC that's contained into a box. Well, yes, but there's more to that. So that box, it's the PC controls everything, USB. It has its own power manager, so you can actually toggle your accessories on and off. And the USB can cycle on and off. That one I find to be a big deal. At least the USB 2 ports will. I don't think the USB 3 ports will, but the USB 2 ports you can toggle remotely off and on. You can toggle any of the power ports off and on. It's self-contained. It's good for the cable management. It's the way to go. And I hook everything up via Ethernet. You can do Wi-Fi. And that's actually something our friend Richard Wright really advised me on, and I wholeheartedly agree. Wi-Fi is very fun and makes life easy in a number of ways, but when you really need to connect to something reliably, you've got to go hardwired, you've got to go Ethernet. You just do. I don't care how good the Wi-Fi is. It's fickle by nature for this application. You can make it work, but you're just buying yourself more frustration. So you need an Ethernet connection. You should establish some kind of a LAN. If let's say you're setting this up and even in your backyard, Wi-Fi is obviously the most tempting thing to do because it's like, I don't want to trench a Ethernet out to my. But depending on what you're doing, even in your backyard, I would still recommend going Ethernet. Also, by doing that, instead of a whole string of cables or the fickle Wi-Fi, you've got one nice singular cable that goes to your entire setup. So all I have going up the pier right now is a power cable and an Ethernet cable, and it'll do everything else. It can, then we're good. Focusers, rotators, dew heaters, the camera itself, the thermoelectric cooler on the camera, the mount. all of it is just going through these two little wires, so it helps your cable management. So and there are other solutions like the Eagle, but that one's we've been setting that up in our smaller observatory, and now with the Skysaway remote observatory here, the Eagle's been our computer of choice for that.
Um, I know someone was asking real quick on the Eagle. Like Brian said, these are made by a company called Prima Luce in Italy. This is an old Eagle too. That's been in the sun and baked. That's not nice and red anymore. But they have they have the Eagle 4 now, and there's some other. You could actually just send a laptop if you really wanted to. But like Brian said, the nice thing about it is, if something goes on, like your camera's being finicky or the filter wheel's being stupid, which you've all been there. You can't just walk into your backyard and unplug the USB. So having something like this where you can toggle that USB and basically remotely unplug it is a really important thing when you're working remote. There's a gentleman online here who is asking, what is your thought between mono versus color? And I wanted to just bring this up real quick. This is a test shot from something in the smaller observatory that you've worked with. This is a color shot that Brian did from the test observatory right next door on another system. This isn't a Skywatcher Esprit 150, but it's another system from what ours was. But this is a one-shot color camera from your site, essentially. So. But what's your thought, being that you are Bortle 2 skies, color becomes an actual viable option.
Yeah, I tend to like the one shot color for that reason. So color, DSLR cameras, they're all color, and there are color options with CCD and CMOS cameras. One shot color is really nice for obvious reasons. It simplifies your setup. It's much easier to obtain your final setup. It has far less processing, and Kevin knows all too well too. But once you get involved in tricolor or narrowband imaging, and you're having to process each of the channels and then blend them in such a way that they're harmoniously making the image that you intend, whereas one shot color is doing all that for you. A hard requirement for one shot color typically is a dark sky, and there are a lot of good new light pollution reduction filters for imaging that do a fantastic job. And the only trade-off to that is you're strategically removing parts of the color spectrum. So when you use those filters, you get a nice image, but you're still missing out on all the true color, like what you would get with that Horsehead Nebula shot. So unless you have a particular application, or if you want to get to the next advanced level of monochrome, I would typically favor, from a dark sky, the one-shot color. Now, there's the Pleiades, right? The reflection nebula, something like blue. You just can't. There isn't really a filter, but that's a broad spectrum. You just need color, and you need dark sky. There's really no substitute for that, especially when you start getting to some of the dark lane stuff. Like you can even start to see, even on this one, surrounding the Pleiades. Now, that being said, you're going to see a lot of narrowband imaging, and you absolutely need a monochrome camera for that. So if you think you're going to do more of that, and I know it can be hard if you're kind of starting out, it can be hard. Well, which one should I do? I would say color. The monochrome is just a lot more work. You can do amazing things with monochrome, and you can image during a full moon. You can shoot through narrowband filters. Narrowband filters is not really a viable option for color. It's not. I've seen people do it, but it's not really a viable option for the most part. But yeah, here's this luminance shot. I believe Kevin shot this with the test setup. And by the way, this is f7. It's not even traditionally considered a fast telescope, but when you have dark skies like this and a good camera and a good telescope, you can pull. This is pulling in a lot of that integrated flux nebulosity, that background wispy. That stuff in color tends to look kind of like an auburn brown, and that's when you're going deep, or you're in a real dark sky. You start getting that IFN in the background. So monochrome will pull in more data, and like I say, it's more work. It really depends on where you're at as an imager. I wouldn't want to jump straight to that. I do color, but if you're in an area where you're just gonna look, if you're in the middle of a Bortle 9 city or something, you might then consider just shooting narrowband and going back to a monochrome camera. But if you're going to go to a dark sky, or if you're setting up in a dark sky, or going to a star party or something where it's going to be dark, definitely go with color. And I feel like because light pollution is a real issue and it's encroaching on all parts of the world, it's becoming a fleeting kind of rare thing to get a nice true color image that hasn't been filtered, because you will see more and more, they're going to be filtered, narrowband or these specialized light pollution reduction filters for good reason. But just this true natural color is becoming kind of a more of a rare thing. Anyway, I hope that answered your question a little bit.
There's another question here. What are your thoughts on pixel size? And I just want to bring this up real quick. Brian can probably elaborate more on it, but pixel size is all over the map, and it really comes down to your telescope focal length to match up with the seeing at that point. So, I know the test telescopes that we've had out there, they're both Esprit 150s. They both have ZWO 6200s, which are IMX 455 sensors, and those are like 3.7 micron pixels, and we have to run those typically binned 2x2 to match up with the seeing at the site because the pixels are so small. But could you elaborate on pixel size of the cameras?
Yeah. Basically, you can think of it: the smaller the pixels on the camera, the higher the resolution per area that you're covering, and so you can measure that in how many arc seconds of sky per pixel is consumed, and that's a combination of the focal length of your telescope and the pixel size of your camera. And that's really your resolution. That's your image scale. So a smaller, let's say if we kept all things constant, let's just use a 1000 millimeter focal length telescope like the Esprit 150, it's like 1050. So it's kind of nice even number to think of. 1000 millimeters of focal length. So let's say we're not going to change the focal length, but we're going to change the pixel size. So on the ASI 6200 mm that we're using, if you shoot full 1x1, it's 3.75 micron pixels. If you shot M51, it fills up a lot more of your screen. It's the same area of sky based on the chip size, but the pixel size will that will determine your resolution. So you get the equivalent of a larger scale image that way. And you need to have the seeing to support it if you go that high. A lot of times we're shooting 2x2 because it's a more relaxed, it's a better match for the Esprit 150, we think. Although there are some nights, actually, we've shot full bore 1x1 and I've gotten some cool shots. I mentioned M51 because we used M51 as an example of that. It's small in relation to the frame of the camera, but if we go 1x1, we get a lot of good image scale. So quick note to mention about image, the pixel size. Traditionally, it's always considered that, okay, the larger pixels, which is true, it's the pixel wells, they encompass a larger area, so they're going to gather more light and more sensitive to light. And that's true if all things are constant. But these new CMOS cameras, back illuminated CMOS cameras pushing 90% quantum efficiency, a camera today at 3 to 4 micron pixels in size will outperform an older generation CCD with 9 micron pixels, and depending on which. I'm generalizing a little bit, so I'm sure some people go, hey, wait a minute, I've got a KAF 16803. What are you trying to say? But no, that's there's the idea that the larger pixel size gathers more light, which is true. But now that the cameras are getting so sensitive to light and the noise is so low, we're bending the rules a little bit. You're finding more and more people are shooting, they're oversampling a little bit. In fact, it's a pretty old article at this point, but Roland at Astrophysics posted a cool article about oversampling for deep sky imaging and how people tend to want to have big pixels with short focal length because everything's sharp and beautiful. You don't need good seeing. But Roland was suggesting pushing that envelope and actually oversampling, similar to like what we would do with planetary imaging. And I think you're seeing more of that. So bottom line is the pixel size will combine with your focal length will kind of determine your resolution, your image scale. We're bending the rules a little bit. We can start to push that envelope because of these new cameras and their performance. and you have good seeing, there's no reason not to try to push the limit. And so you will find a lot of wide angle astro imaging is relaxed. It's like 1, 2, 3 arc seconds per pixel. And so it almost doesn't even matter. I mean, overgeneralize again, almost doesn't even matter what you're seeing is if you're shooting at, more than 2 arc seconds per pixel or 3 arc seconds per pixel, but you get nice sharp results, but you're not utilizing the full potential resolution of your sky and your telescope and your camera. So if you really, and especially right now, it's galaxy season. Now is the time you might want to push that envelope, longer focal length and or smaller pixels. Here's a good shot of M101. I believe was this one that Richard Wright had captured with the Esprit 150. I don't remember whether he was shooting 2x2 or 1x1 on this one.
I think it was a 2x2 shot.
And something to keep in mind with those big cameras, this is still now, you're taking it down to a mere 16 megapixel camera, binned 2x2, as opposed to the 60 megapixel at 1x1. So you're still shooting like basically the kind of resolution that cameras have been doing for the last for many years, but with so much more sensitivity and low noise. And so there's a lot to obviously consider.
That's so I know there's a lot of stuff that we've been talking about today, and we are coming down to the last little bit of it. An hour flies by with a lot of. If you guys are interested in learning more about Skies Away or hosting a telescope at Skies Away, you can actually just go to skiesaway.com, and then right up top here they've got Skies Away remote observatories. You can just click in there, and then that'll take you to learning more about the remote setup. And if you want to know pricing and availability and all that fun stuff, you can just email them out there, and I'm sure Bryan and their team will be happy to discuss any of that with you. There are only 6 piers in this observatory, so maybe there'll be more on another build in the future, but it would be something to think about if you're really looking, or if you've got a club and you want to do a shared telescope and you just want it in a dark sky site. That's something to think about too. But yeah, if you're interested, go to, let me put that back up here. That's actually skiesaway.com is the main, and then there's remote.skiesaway.com for the remote site. But that's their website. Give them an email or a call, and I'm sure Bryan will be happy to discuss with you about what it takes to host the scope out there. I will say real quick, in case people get confused, this particular site at the moment is for sending your equipment there and having access for it. There's not a telescope on site for you to rent at the moment. Maybe that'll be something that you guys do in the future, but just as I know there's been some confusion a little bit there, so.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you for bringing that up and reminding me that it's a good point to bring up. It's and there are solutions out there where you can rent telescopes like through SLU and things of that nature. But this is for your personal telescope that you'd bring here. Obviously, it would be your personal property that you would bring here, and it would be hosted here at the dark sky. I'm on site, so I provide the support on site as well as the installation and monitored things and everything here. And the site that you mentioned, remote.skiesaway.com, we're going to be posting the telemetry page, pretty soon. That'll start to show you. Anyone will be able to just check that out if they want to see it. We'll be posting the seeing data from our SM1 seeing monitor. We'll have an all sky cam, which is connected at the moment, but we're going to get all that hooked up on the telemetry page with the weather, the all sky, the seeing, the SQM. To give you an idea, so you can always just kind of check it out. Anyone could just go on and check it out. Hey, how's the sky looking today? Or or I want to peek inside the roll off because we've got the cameras hooked up as well. So that's going online shortly. But certainly reach out. You can email contact@skiesaway.com. We post our phone number there too, so you can always just call if you have any questions about kind of the particulars about how you would get your setup out here.
Very cool. Thank you very much, Bryan, for taking the morning to hang out with us, and thanks everybody for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you like what we do here at the What's Up Webcast, go ahead and subscribe. If you want to talk to Bryan and reach out to them about getting your install out there, because you guys are ready for installs pretty much at this
That's
point.
correct,
So yeah, there's
online.
they're ready to go for your scope. Take advantage of those crazy skies. So reach out to them. Bryan will get you taken care of. But yeah, if you guys have any further questions, go ahead and email those direct to Bryan through their website. So thanks very much, Bryan. Thank you everyone for watching, and of course we will see you guys next week. So have a good weekend and stay safe, and of course clear skies to everyone as well.
Great. Thank you very much.
Take care, Bryan.
All right. See ya.